Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be going over all the different loot systems in World of Warcraft Classic and World of Warcraft Classic TBC. Going to be covering loot systems like DKP, Loot Council, EPGP, the Onslaught loot system, Soft Reserve, main spec versus off spec, basically all of the main ones. And really just going through, what are the pros and cons of each, and ultimately what is the best system. So let's get started with what are the goals of the loot system? What's the point? The reason why you are going to use a loot system is to try and keep the people in your guild happy so they don't leave. You're going to do that by trying to make things fair. And then there's also a goal of a loot system, and not every loot system enforces this, but a lot of loot systems will try to improve the raid. That way, as your guild is preparing for the next raid tier that is going to be harder, the guild is improving and going to be able to clear the next raid that comes out, and also make the current raid that you're clearing easier to get through week to week. So when it comes to fairness, sometimes in a loot system, that means that you're going to make sure everybody gets the same amount of loot total. The counter there is sometimes items are going to be really good. Sometimes items aren't going to be very good. So another way in which fairness is achieved is by looking at the quality of the loot that you're getting and trying to, give equal quality of upgrades to each player. Another way they look at it is equal opportunity to get loot. This is going to be in the systems that roll for a year. Everybody's got the same shot, but sometimes players are going to get lucky and have more loot than everybody else. And then another way that fairness is tried to be achieved in some guilds is to give loot based on effort. And the way they see it is if someone's trying super hard and another person isn't, and maybe doesn't even show up as much, the person that is trying harder, that puts in more time, more gold, does better, has better results, does more damage, they're going to get more loot than someone who puts in less effort. Now, it obviously depends on the group of players you're playing with and the guild's goals on, what metric of fairness is going to apply. But these are the main ways in which, guilds try and keep things fair. When it comes to improving the raid, this is something that's not as important when it comes to Classic because the game is not terribly difficult at this point with so much game knowledge from previously doing all the raids. But for guilds that want to take things very seriously, it's important that they're improving. If it comes to some sort of speed running or just going for parsing. But even just your everyday normal guild at least wants to get stronger week to week. And so it can help your raid to prioritize certain items to certain classes or certain players. Examples being you can prioritize a Thunder Fury to the best of your tanks. That way, your best tank has a big increase to threat, and that can really increase the smoothness of your raids. You can also give items to the classes that benefit the most. So for example, Band of Ikuria is on the screen here, and Band of Ikuria is a great item for a rogue. Not quite as good for a Fury Warrior. However, below it you see Quick Strike Ring, which is a great item for a Fury Warrior, not so great for a rogue. So what a lot of guilds will do is they will prioritize items to classes that benefit the most, meaning the Band of Ikuria would be going to a rogue and the Quick Strike Ring would be going to a Fury Warrior. That way, both players that get the item are happy that they got a piece of best in slot gear that they're not going to replace for a very long time. And they know that, an item was given to somebody and it's going to last, instead of just giving it wish-wash, to whoever that might not actually end up mattering much long-term. So that is the way in which a lot of loot systems are going to try and keep people from leaving. And I think that's the most important thing. Really, the loot system is about just making sure people don't leave the guild, making sure people are happy, that they think it's fair, and even coming down to improving the raid, right? The end reason you want to improve the raid is so that you can clear the content that comes out in the next raid tier, and that, because if you don't, people will leave, right? So that's really generally the goal of the guild, is to not disband and clear the content. So moving on to the individual loot systems, we'll start with main spec versus off spec, right? So main spec versus off spec is something you're going to see a lot in pugs. The thing about main spec versus off spec is it is going to have no bias when it comes to the actual rolling itself. It's extremely easy to implement. However, where things get a little bit murky is what constitutes main spec versus off spec. So for some people, main spec versus off spec means, can you equip the item? Does it give you primary stats? That's basically the bare minimum of what some groups are going to allow. Meaning, a feral druid would be able to roll on aged core leather gloves because it's leather, they can equip it, has strength, stamina, crit. Hey, those are stats that benefit them. So a feral druid would be able to get this item. Even if there's a dagger rogue in the group that also wants the item, right? Other ways or examples would be Choker the Firelord. A lot of times healers will be allowed to roll on Choker the Firelord in a main spec versus off spec group because technically speaking, it would be an upgrade for their character that they would equip. Same goes for like a hunter trying to get Belt of Never-Ending Agony, or a warrior. Even though they have items they can get from previous raids, the idea being, they can equip it, they can roll on it. So the biggest flaw with main spec versus off spec is, number one, there's limited priority, so it's going to feel bad in a lot of cases when a class that doesn't really utilize an item very well gets it. However, there's, again, beyond determining what is main spec versus off spec, there's no bias, there's no room for individuals to take advantage of their power in a guild, and you're just going to roll off items. It's extremely simple, easy to implement, but again, there is still a little bit of trouble that can come with main spec versus off spec. Sometimes you'll see that if there's a hunter leading the raid, they're going to be a little more biased maybe on what constitutes a main spec hunter item. Whereas if you have a fury warrior, maybe they'd be much more willing to let warriors roll on leather gear. So there is going to be some bias there, but all in all, main spec versus off spec is simple and just requires very little setup, and that's why it's used in a lot of pugs. Next, we've got the soft reserve system. So how the soft reserve system works is you essentially call dibs on an item. What that means is these days you use a website to select the items that you want from a raid, and once you've selected those items, you will get them if they drop, unless someone else also selected that item. In that case, you would just roll to do a tiebreaker. And the idea of this system is now, instead of just a pure randomness, we're starting to be able to identify some of the items that you specifically want. So if I'm rogue, I can specifically choose weapons that I'm seeking out, or trinkets or rings that I want, and I can increase my chance at getting the stuff that I really care about. Whereas in a full, run where we're just rolling, there might be a warrior that doesn't really care about this ring, and they win it. And I might not have really cared about this bow, and I want it. When in reality, if we would have had a soft reserve system, I would have soft reserved, the ring that the warrior didn't really want. He would have soft reserved the bow, and then, basically what soft reserve does is it increases the chances that loot goes to people that actually want it. And, it's, again, really simple because of the website exists. It is going to have, very little drama. The reason why soft reserve has almost no drama is because you have the ability to soft reserve, a lot of people feel like that means you have no right to complain on a roll. And the mindset is, okay, if you're going to complain about the main spec versus off spec rules, if you're not happy about how an item was distributed, you should have soft reserved it. And so soft reserve has very low drama. There's no bias when it comes to the soft reserve. Again, no human input except for main spec versus off spec restrictions. And, once again, we're increasing the priority a little bit. There's no priority on the behalf of like the guild or the person in charge. However, players are able to prioritize the items for themselves. So in a soft reserve system, we're starting to move a little bit towards items going to the classes that benefit the most, just by people being allowed to select the items they want. However, that's not really harshly enforced, and obviously soft reserve is prone to players that, reserving items that aren't really that good for them. But they just want them, right? Which is a good and a bad thing, right? Because sometimes you're in a guild and you can't get a hold of an item you really want because, the guild's convinced it's not very good for you, but you really want it. So a trade-off there. So moving past soft reserve, we have DKP, dragon kill points. Essentially how the system works is you get points for showing up to raid, you spend points to get gear. What it does is make sure that people that are attending the most amount of raids are getting the most loot, and people that don't show up don't get as much loot. And it also is attempting to control the amount of items each player gets. So previously in the soft reserve system, from week to week, it's just pure randomness. I might have 10 items, you might have one, just because I got lucky with rolls over the course of several weeks. When it comes to DKP, you're not going to see as much disparity between the number of items amongst people in a guild because, well, I can't just keep getting items because I'm going to run out of points. And, so that is the main theme of Dragon, kill points. Now, when it comes to DKP, there are a lot of different ways in which you go about spending the points. So I said really simply, you spend the points that you get from showing up to raid. This can be accomplished through bidding on items. DKP can have set values. And ultimately, you're usually going to have something to track everyone's points, usually an add-on. Now, the problem sometimes with DKP, again, everything, there's pros and cons, right? So a pro of DKP is there's no randomness. A con of DKP would be that now, things are getting a little more complex. We have to start keeping track of everything. The biggest issue with DKP that a lot of guilds find is dealing with how to spend the points. A lot of guilds will do bidding. And the reason they do bidding is because it's extremely difficult to set a value for how good an item is, right? How many points should Archimedes' Ring of Reckoning be in a DKP guild? This item is not good for anyone in raiding. However, a lot of people really want it for PvP. So how many points should this thing have? I don't know. How many points should Storm Rage's handguards? I mean, probably not very many because there's not many druids, but how do you know how many points to set to items? Some loot systems are going to set values based on the slot and say, okay, all items that are hands are going to have this set value multiplied by like the item level, right? But again, would it really make sense if like a ring that is not good for anyone in raiding would have the same DKP cost as something like a pure Elementium band, which is an amazing healing ring? That wouldn't really make sense. So ultimately, the problem with DKP is it's very difficult to assign values that are good. So the vast majority of guilds are going to use bidding to determine how much an item is worth in terms of points when you go to spend your points. So there are additionally problems with DKP when it comes to bidding. If you're doing open bids, you can ride up somebody else's bid. If you don't like someone or you compete with them with loot, you can keep increasing the bid on an item they really want and essentially waste their points. And if the bidding is blind, you can collude with other members to predetermine ahead of time how much you're going to bid. So I can go over to my rogue friends and be like, okay, guys, I don't like warriors, right? We hate those guys. And we know DFT is about to drop. So we need to make sure as much points as possible are on the rogues, and we want the warriors to lose as many points as possible. So what we're going to do is between the rogues, we're going to agree not to bid very much on a lot of items, and ahead of time we'll figure out who's getting what, and we'll like do fake bids. That way, when an item is being rolled off, instead of spending 150 points and then another guy, wants 200 and then 250, and all of a sudden, it's costing a lot of points to get an item, they agree ahead of time, like, okay, we'll do the minimum amount of points and we'll just let this guy have it. That way we save up our points. So that's collusion. That's like things can players can do things that are not allowed in the system, but they're trying to cheat the system, basically. So there is room for that in DKP, unfortunately. Now, there is no bias when it comes to DKP at the leadership point of view, but you can, again, have problems on the individual basis. Another thing about DKP, and this doesn't really have to do with any bias or anything, just how the system ends up working, is Classes that have niche items or weird itemization are always going to benefit the most from the system. And the best way I can explain this is druids in Classic are the weakest healer. You generally are going to see the least amount of druid healers in a raid out of all the healers because they are the weakest healer. Now, in a DKP guild, that actually gives the druid the advantage because they have less competition for tier gear. So again, an item like Storm Rage Handguards drops. If you've got 1 or 2 druids, I mean, they're not going to get into a huge bidding war over this item. Who cares? If there's 1 druid, they get it, for the minimum amount. If there's 2 druids, why get into a massive fight over a pair of gloves? You're just going to get the next one. And so what ends up happening is if there's only a few druids in the guild, they have way more DKP than, for example, the priests or the paladins or the shamans that are fighting over tier gear as it drops. They're bidding back and forth. And so when a big item like, something like a Locomere or a Rejuve Gem drops, the druid, which is the worst healer, has the most DKP to get it. So you'll see that sometimes, and the same thing happens with hunters. Hunters are not considered to be the highest damage dealers in Classic by any means, but because they're easier to gear up compared to a warrior or a rogue, they will have more points than warriors and rogues, and they will get the big items over warriors and rogues because they have more points. So the problem with DKP is you got to get a few issues that can arise, and sometimes guilds are going to step in and start enforcing priorities to try and solve these problems. So if they don't want a hunter taking the very best item, then the guild has to step in and say, okay, I know we're supposed to be following this point system, but a hunter, you're not allowed to get this sword because it's better for rogues and warriors. And even though you have more points than them, we want to make sure that the sword goes to the class that benefits the most. So that is a lot of guilds that follow a DKP system will still prioritize items, which means that the whole part of DKP not having any bias kind of goes out the window if you then have to start using priorities to determine what classes get stuff. So long story short with DKP, maybe sound like I'm being overly critical of DKP. I want to be clear that DKP is an amazing system for PvPers or specs that are not necessarily considered the best, because you're able to play weaker specs and get really good items, whereas in a loot council guild or in a guild that was maybe focusing on prioritizing items more, you would not be able to get them as a weaker class. However, a lot of the stronger classes might feel that is unfair. So I think DKP is a great system for weaker specs, a great system for people who like to PvP and want to pick up items that aren't necessarily going to be considered the best for your class when it comes to raiding, but are good for PvP. And at the end of the day, DKP just lets you pick what you want. You have control as a player in the guild to bid points on what you want. You can save up for big items. You're not at the whim of RNG. You're not at the whim of, your guild deciding if you should get an item or not. If you want an item, you can save up points, and if you have the most, it's yours. So DKP is definitely a system that has both its pros and its cons, and it can definitely be a good system for a lot of players. Next, we get EPGP. Now, EPGP, it's kind of confusing to explain the very specifics of how it works, but essentially it ends up working kind of like a round robin in that the more raids you show up to, the more effort points you get, the more gear you get, the more gear points you get, and your priority is based on a ratio. And what that essentially means is if I have gone to every raid and I have never gotten a piece of gear, I'm way at the top of the list because I haven't gotten an item ever and I keep showing up to raids. So I have anytime an item drops, it's my choice whether or not I take it, if it's something that I can use. Now, as soon as I take an item, I'm going to go way down the priority list because all of a sudden now I have a bunch of gear points spent on an item. And, the next person after me that has, gone to the most raids and still doesn't have an item, then they get their pick as items drop on what they want. Now, the problem I have with EPGP is there's a lot of passing that occurs where you are not willing to take an item because it will reduce your priority on something big. So, for example, let's say Drakefang Talisman is an item that I'm after in Nightslayer Boots drop. Now, I might want Nightslayer Boots, but I'm going to pass on them And I was actually in an EPGP guild with this exact situation where I wanted Drake Fang Talisman and Night Slayer boots dropped. I wanted them, but I passed because I didn't want to affect my priority, and I was the top rogue on Drake Fang Talisman. Meanwhile, other rogues went ahead and spent points on Night Slayer boots and lowered their priority, even though they got a very weak item. And so a problem with EPGP is I feel it is very, very punishing towards newer players or players that aren't necessarily as savvy with how the gear system works, as you'll end up spending all your points on weak items, destroying your priority, and the really good items are going to go to the people who are a little more savvy with the system. Now, one way to try and solve this is to do a sort of bidding on the really good items, just like with DKP. You have the same issue where how do you set a point value to an item? And that's just something that is difficult to do perfectly. You have all the same issues of DKP if it's open or blind bids. Same problem amount. When it comes to complexity, EPGP is a little more complex than DKP, but it's still, you still have add-ons that can track it and do most of the stuff for you, so it's still not terribly complicated. But again, there's no randomness. Players have control. If you save up all your points, you are in the position to take an item that you want. But again, a lot of the same issues of DKP where you're going to feel like you have to pass on items. Sometimes you want to maintain first priority on something you really want way more. And, there can be a lot of gaming the system when it comes to trying getting the most out of your points. Next, we'll go to Loot Council. Now, you might have been listening to that and be like, some of this stuff is kind of complicated. Some of this stuff is confusing. Items are going to go to players that shouldn't get them. Loot Council is where everything is fully based on priority. The vast majority of Loot Council guilds' goal is to give items that are best in slot to the classes that it's best for. And so what that's going to mean is, if something like rejuvenating gem drops, they're going to give it to, obviously they're going to be giving it to a healer, right? Something like Neltharion teardrops, it's obviously going to a caster. But a Loot Council guild is going to go one step further, and they're going to say, like, okay, we're going to try and give rejuvenating gem to the best healer. We're going to try and give Neltharion's tear to the best caster, or one of the caster specs that has the most trouble getting hit. So, for example, a lot of people, fight back and forth on where Neltharion's tear should go, but there's going to be some classes that don't struggle with hit as much, probably shouldn't get Neltharion's tear, and some classes that struggle with hit a lot that would really want Neltharion's tear. But obviously there is a ton of drama, very prone to drama. A lot of the previous systems are not going to have as much drama because players have control. Again, at the end of the day, when it comes to DKP, it was your points. Soft reserve, you could have soft reserved. Main spec versus off spec, hey, you just lost a roll. But when it comes to Loot Council, there is absolutely heavily prone to drama because you can scrutinize any decision that is made by the council as being correct or incorrect. And again, just to clarify, Loot Council, what it means is when an item drops, a group, it could be one player, it could be 10 players, a group of players determine where the item should go. So a lot of times there's not rolling, there's no point systems. It's just as items are dropped, they're dealt to the player that the council thinks is most deserving. So there's no randomness, which is nice. The biggest pro of Loot Council is every item can be prioritized. Every item can go to the person that it's going to benefit the most. The problem is the system can be either terrible or amazing. And I think anyone can accept the fact that in a hypothetical world, Loot Council is the best system. Because in a Loot Council guild, if you were to have like some all-knowing, WoW gamer that just could perfectly distribute gear in a fair way that, helped the guild maximally, right? In this alternate universe, Loot Council would be the perfect system if the person distributing the loot always makes the right decision. the exact opposite is also true. If you have an absolute clown in charge, the absolute worst decision could be made at every point, and the system could be terrible. And so loot council can be very variant from guild to guild, and you're really it's a big trade-off. You're essentially saying that I don't want to see items going to classes that are going to waste them, so I'm willing to put faith in a group of people to determine where the items should go, so that items are used most efficiently, so that you don't see weird stuff happening, like aged core leather gloves going to druids, choker of the firelord going to healers, belt of never-ending agony going to hunters, right? If you want to make sure nothing weird like that ever happens, you enter into a loot council, and you risk the fact that you're not going to have as much control as an individual player if you're not on the council, but the reward is that, a lot of times items are going to be making more sense where they're distributed. But again, it can really vary. Some guilds, the GM just takes every item, or the GM's girlfriend gets a bunch of loot, right? It can be very, very varied experience from guild to guild. When it comes to complexity, loot council, in my opinion, is by far the most complex. When it comes to trying to avoid drama, you got to go out of your way to try and prepare material like spreadsheets or PDFs explaining why items are going to go to certain players. There are loot council guilds can have hour-long discussions spanning multiple days to determine where an item should go. So loot council definitely is the most complex system, takes the most time, and like I said, it can be the best, can be the worst. And it really depends on if you're in a good loot council guild, whether or not it's going to be a good system. And the last system I'm going to go over is the Onslaught loot system. Now, the Onslaught loot system, players, what they do is they rank their favorite items, and then as an item drops, the player who rated the item highest gets it, and if it's a tie, you roll. So essentially, I might say my favorite item in the game is Jom Gabar. I'm going to put it number 1 on my list. Jom Gabar drops. If I'm the only person that had it number 1 on my list, I get the item. And if there was a tie, we're going to roll for it, on and on. So the nice thing about the Onslaught loot system is a player is able to choose what items they want, and there's absolutely no bias, which makes it actually a really strong candidate for being a great loot system, right? Because your players are able to pick what they want, and there's no randomness. That's pretty good. When it comes to the downsides, one of the downsides is that it's extremely weighted on attendance, and this is something you can obviously alternate from guild to guild, but at least with the Onslaught loot system, how it works, how they describe how they would use it, the guild that created the system, is that it's extremely punishing if you ever miss a raid. So if you even just miss one raid, you're going to fall very far behind a lot of people. So it really encourages everyone showing up every single time, which is important for a guild. But in some guilds that are less serious, sometimes they don't want people to feel like if they just miss a raid because real life stuff came up, that they're going to be really far behind. Another big issue with the Onslaught loot system is new players are going to get destroyed. And let me explain, right? Let's say there is a new player that thinks Bloodfang shoulders are cool. Now, Bloodfang shoulders, when Blackwing Lair came out, were not particularly good when it comes to rating. Not one of the better shoulders in the game. Not even better than Night Slayer shoulders, right? And even worse than stuff like True Strike. So worse than some blue items you can get. However, they look really cool. So the problem is, if you have a newer player that's maybe less savvy when it comes to creating their loot list, they might rank something like Bloodfang's shoulders really highly, and that was not at all necessary, right? And they're essentially handicapping all of the gear that they could get. And you might have a new player who has Bloodfang shoulders, and he's got Bloodfang boots and Bloodfang gloves, and he picks up all the items that are kind of not very good for rogues out of Blackwing Lair, and meanwhile all the other rogue players have taken everything good. So a real big issue for me is that in the Onslaught loot system, you need to have very skilled players. So if you're in a pretty hardcore guild, if game knowledge is very high within the guild, I think the system is actually a very good system. But if you're going to introduce new players, if there's going to be players that are a little more casual, maybe not necessarily do as much research into items, I do not think the Onslaught system is good at all. I'll give another example. Let's say a player likes the item called Venomous Totem. Now this item sucks. It's not a good item. You can get Venomous Totem by arranging your loot list and ranking your items. You can just rank Venomous Totem like not dead last, and you'll probably get it, right? It's so bad that almost every rogue probably is going to have it at the very bottom. So if you just rank it as your like 20th item out of 25, like your bottom 5 favorite, you'll probably still get it first when it drops. But if a new player doesn't really understand how the system works and isn't savvy about it, they might put Venomous Totem number 1 on their list because they like poisons, they think it's cool, and their loot list is locked in place for the tier. And well, I mean, they're going to get Venomous Totem. They could have gotten it without sacrificing priority like crazy, and they're really going to get the short end of the stick. But you're going to see that almost every loot system is going to benefit players that are savvy with gaming the system, basically except Loot Council. Loot Council is the only system where you cannot be savvy with the system and gain a significant advantage over other players by just understanding how loot works better than other people, right? If you're an EPGP guild, you can take the best items. DKP guild, you can save up, make the most out of each, point that you gain. Soft reserve, you can soft reserve the items that are contested the least, or week to week change your soft reserves based on what's the most valuable soft reserve. But really, Loot Council is the only system that is going to avoid gaming of the system in that way. But the counter could be, if you're just nice to an officer, maybe they'll give you loot. So you could argue that too, that, well, the opportunity to game the system is just replaced with opportunity to, butter someone up and get some items in return. So, but the Onslaught loot system, I think, is an amazing loot system for guilds that are more hardcore, because you have the player control combined with no randomness except for ties, and there's no bias. So, but ultimately, that's the last loot system I was talk about there. Now I'm going to talk about my favorite, and it's actually Loot Council. You might be surprised I said that. And the reason why Loot Council is my favorite system is because I really get bothered when items are given to the wrong players and stuff is inefficient. And the reason for that is I believe most players want to have a best in slot gear list, right? They look at the best items in the game and they want to get them. And I feel like every time you're in a guild in which items are given to the wrong class, and I don't mean like, I want to be clear, if somebody thinks an item's cool or they really like it or they have a lot of fun with it, that's not really what I mean. What I mean is like a ring that drops. It's a ring. It's not like it looks cool or anything. It's not like generally people aren't going to be super attached to getting a specific ring just because of the name or something, right? But if a ring drops and we give it to the wrong class, the class that benefits, very little from it, what we just essentially did is wasted a lot of people's time, wasted the item, and now people are going to have to keep coming to the raid longer if they want to reach their best in slot until they get the item to drop. I mean, you can ask around WoW players. I'm sure everybody has stories of the time that item they really wanted dropped and it went ahead and ended up in someone else's inventory that wouldn't even have used it very well. So that's something that's really annoying to me. I think it's also bad for guild morale, especially when items feel like they're wasted like that. And that's a very common complaint you hear about people, complaining about loot, complaining about something that happened in a guild run. Is like, oh man, I just can't believe it. They gave Drakefang Talisman to a hunter, and the hunter doesn't even use the hit. He's got 11% hit, and the hit did literally nothing. And I'm really disappointed because now I have to keep running Blackwing Lair and wait for another one to drop, right? So the problem with Loot Council obviously was that there could be a lot of bias. And so I feel that the way to counter the bias is to have predetermined Loot Council, and you predetermine ahead of time where items are going to go. You have spreadsheets, and you're able to tell people in advance what is going to happen. An example would be right here. Let's say we have a spreadsheet where we list some items. We have DFT, CTS, Maladath, Presters, and we got the different people that are going to get them first, second, third, and fourth. And the reason I like doing Loot Council in this way is you're able to efficiently distribute items to players that are going to benefit the most. It's a system that is going to help new players a lot. And this is something I really care about a lot when it comes to distributing loot, because I've had countless new players in guilds, especially because I haven't played in the most hardcore of hardcore guilds, for a bit here. And, there's just a lot of players that come into the guild that are really newbie, that don't know what's going on. And 1 month will pass, and then they're reading every best in slot sheet. They're trying to master their class, and they actually have a really good understanding of the game. They just were new when they first started. And so seeing firsthand, as I've seen probably over 20 players that I've played with firsthand in guilds start off as extremely noobs and end up becoming, very good players that were really knowledgeable on the class. I really dislike loot systems that are really punishing to new players, because I think Classic is a game that is very noob friendly, and you can raid with a lot of different skill level players. And I think that's a really fun thing about the game. And I really don't like being in loot systems where like I can literally, I was in an EPGP guild again, and I mean, I just watched as rogues kept spending points on Night Slayer boots, and Drakefang Talisman would just go to the same, like all of the good items would go to the same person every single time, because there were noobs in the guild that didn't understand how the gear worked. And it was in the best interest of the savvy players to not tell them. Like, why would you tell the noob player, hey, you shouldn't roll on Night Slayer boots, if that means they're going to get your Drakefang Talisman that you could otherwise have, right? So that's a big reason I like Loot Council, is because, I want a loot system that's going to be good for noobs. I want a loot system that is not going to waste gear. And, while it does take a lot of effort on the side of the guild, I think good loot councils can really do things really quite well. And as long as you're transparent ahead of time and you communicate, where the items are going to go, let's take the position of, Doug here. Let's say Doug really wants DFT and he sees the list and he's like, wait, like, I'm last on DFT. What's going on, right? If loot hasn't been distributed, he can then have a discussion, and he can either leave the guild if he disagrees with the guild, again, before the items have dropped. So he doesn't have a horrific horror story about how he was in a guild 6 months, 3 DFTs dropped, he didn't get a single one, and he's really upset, right? If he would have known ahead of time what was going to happen, he could have left before any DFTs even dropped. Or he could have gotten the loot list changed. Let's say he says he really wants DFT, and it turns out he doesn't want CTS and Maladeth very much. And then you talk amongst the other players, and they're okay with it. And Doug goes up to first on DFT, and Bob moves up higher on CTS and Maladeth to replace Doug, right? And that would make sense. And I personally think that as long as people know what's happening ahead of time, they have the opportunity to discuss it before loot drops, before it's distributed. And by the time it ends up being distributed, well, at that point it's on the individual player. They had every opportunity to discuss how they think the loot should have been done differently. And if they didn't raise an issue, well, you can only do so much. So I really like Loot Council. I think it does a great job of distributing loot when done properly, and when it's done improperly, well, should leave the guild. I have been in Loot Council guilds as both an officer and as a member. I have left Loot Council guilds before because I thought they weren't doing something fairly, and I've been in Loot Council guilds that I thought, did things really well. So that's my take on it. Again, going through the pros and cons, a different loot system might be better for your guild. So if you're a super hardcore guild, I think the Onslaught system could be really good. If you're a really casual guild and you just don't really care about, making sure items are going to the classes that use it most, something like a DKP system is really going to help make sure that players get to pick the items they want. And an EPGP is a great system for, it's kind of similar to DKP, but if you just want to alternate between items and stuff like that, it can work great. Soft Reserve is a great system if you ever need to pug, as it's really easy to integrate, additional players into the system. You just say, hey, we're a guild, but we can add a couple more people in and just do a Soft Reserve, and there's no problems. And Soft Reserve is also, again, easy, quick, easy for pugs. But yeah, so those are my opinions on all the different loot systems. At the end of the day, when you join a guild, pick a loot system that is fair to you. There's a lot of systems that aren't going to feel fair to you, but are going to feel fair to other people. So it's important that when you join a guild, if you're someone that likes to do a ton of damage and wants to be rewarded for putting in extra effort, you should really join a guild that does that. You shouldn't join a guild that gives items equally to everyone and then just fester the whole time angry that noobs are getting gear when you think you're better, right? Again, I would ask questions proactively on what items you're allowed to roll on. Ask questions actively on who is getting what items, especially in loot council guilds. And I would always leave guilds that are shady, especially if a guild ever lies to you, you should immediately leave. And if a guild ever is not willing to be honest with you, you should leave as well. Whether they're not, willing to give you information that you feel you need to know, or if you think there's shady stuff going on with DKP or EPGP, people are manipulating the system. But yeah, anyway, let me know. What do you guys think? What's your favorite loot system? Give me your opinions in the comments below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.